So, Linda, thank you so much for agreeing to join me for one of our In Conversation series conversations. I'm just really excited to speak to you, and it was a fortuitous meeting that I had with a colleague of yours, and we were just chatting about this project, the Secret Garden Experience, and she said the person you need to speak to is Linda Gask. And I'm so thrilled that she did. So Linda, you're a writer and a psychiatrist, but I know that your experience is way bigger than that, and your background. So I wonder if you would tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm an academic. I went to medical school in Edinburgh. I trained as a psychiatrist, but I became a professor of psychiatry in Manchester. And I've experienced my own mental health problems since I was a medical student. But I spent my life treating people with common mental health problems, anxiety and depression. And I've recently, in the last few years, moved back up to Scotland. So I live in Orkney now. But I write. I've written about my own experience in a couple of books.
And in fact, I'm reading one of them right now, and I'm finding it difficult to put it down. It's really compelling reading. Yeah, so I would recommend that, Finding True North.
Thank you.
And so when we spoke about coming onto this series, we were talking about it in connection to the Secret Garden book and the Secret Garden Experience, because in that book there are issues that Colin particularly has, but potentially also other characters, for mental and physical health issues. And what was interesting for me when I first read the book with a mind to producing it for stage was this idea that Colin was physically ill, and that what they did was they took him into the garden and sort of said, oh, if you just try, you'll walk. And I found that a really difficult concept. But what I've begun to understand as I've researched more and looked at it more and read into it more is that actually a lot of the issues that Colin has are mental health issues. Yes. And I just wanted to know, when you read it, and I think you've reread it recently, what your understanding has been, you know, with your experience and expertise.
I'm not a child psychiatrist, but I've treated many people who lost parents as children.
Yeah.
Which isn't uncommon for people with adult depression. And what comes over to me is that Colin, he didn't know his mother, but he's grieving the mother that he never had. He's grieving the loss of his father as well, who's left him. And he develops a fear, I think, and almost a belief that he is going to die and that he's disabled. And that he is quite depressed and anxious, but he's also very angry, which I know is something that happens in children who are bereaved. They can get angry and difficult and awkward. That's not uncommon. Behavior is sometimes a sign that we're not feeling good inside ourselves. And I see his physical problems as related to his mental health problems. I think that, you know, there's much less of a kind of, we often think of the mind and the body as quite separate, but they're not. They're entirely related to each other. And a lot of what he's experiencing is fear and anxiety and being overwhelmed by what's happened to him. And a lot of his fears are kind of confirmed by people telling him, you should stay in bed. You know, you'll catch chill if you go outside. And I think he saw one doctor, I think, who suggested that might not be the case, but everyone else around him is confirming that and it isn't until that that he's challenged.
Yes, by Mary.
By Mary,
yes.
that
yeah.
He kind of, no one else has treated him in that way.
Yes, and I think he hears it in whispers as well, doesn't he? Because he's so fearful, and he starts to have, hysterics, or as they call them, tantrums.
Yes.
They all back off from him, and they're fed up with him as adults, and so that also compounds it, doesn't it?
Yes, it all confirms that he is this impossible person that no one can do anything with.
Yeah.
And that cycle just keeps going round.
Yeah.
And then he meets a person who doesn't know all of that and just challenges him.
Yeah.
And
somebody of his own age.
Yes.
Because Mary also is used to having her own way. So actually, it's a clash that really works, doesn't it?
Yes, and I think they have things in common as well, in that they have both been neglected. They've both, in a sense, grieved a life that they haven't experienced. I mean, Colin's a bright boy. He's reading. He knows about life, and he knows that his life should have been different, but it isn't. And so they chime in some way, I think, which is really quite magical.
Yes. And do you think that when a child grieves, like you've said, there's children who lose their parents, whose parents die when they're children, do you think their grief process is very different from the adult grief process?
I'm not a child psychiatrist, so it's not easy for me to answer that. But I do know that, children, it depends on the age at which children lose a parent. And I think the thing about Colin is that he's never known his mother. And he's really grieving a mother that he never had. He's grieving a life that he never had. And that comes out that with I know that with children that often comes out more in behavior than in terms of other things, but also it can be very changeable, and children can cope and then not cope. And he's not had any opportunity from anybody to really talk about his loss. He has been left alone to deal with it.
And it's interesting when Mary says, "Let me look at your back." There isn't so much as a bump on this back. And actually, the adults confirm that and say, "Well, if you'd asked me, I could have told you that." And that's also that sense of being alone, being isolated, and not being able to speak about your greatest fears.
Yes, because really no one's given him an offer to talk about that. And I think it's that, would you like to talk about it? No one has really asked him that.
No.
Everyone has backed off, and he's been left, he's isolated himself, which is something that people do when they feel very low and anxious. But he's also been neglected, because when he behaves badly, people back off. Rather than seeing that behavior as a sign that he's very, very unhappy.
And I think what Mary and Colin go through in the story, and the story was written 100 years ago, there are quite a lot of parallels, aren't there, to what's happening for young people, well, not just young people, but people as a result of lockdown and COVID. And in your experience, in what ways does isolation impact on mental health issues? And what if any, what are the solutions? What are the ways that we can help others or help ourselves?
I think for young people, it's been a really difficult time, because when you're young, a year is such a larger part of your life than it is when you're 12. or 10 than it is when you're in your 50s.
Yeah.
So it feels like forever.
Mm.
And it gives you this terrible sense of hopelessness and uncertainty about what's going to change.
Mm.
And some children are much more gregarious than others. I mean, some children, I've no doubt, will have enjoyed being away from school,
Yeah.
because maybe they've been bullied, or maybe they're just like me. I used to love being on my own and reading books. I wasn't a terribly gregarious child. But if your child is someone who really enjoys being with other people and needs that buzz, then this has been a really, really difficult time.
Mm.
And even if you're a loner, most of us had a best friend that we spent time with, someone who we shared our secrets with. And that's been impossible. So that isolation, I think I can fully understand why parents are concerned that their children are anxious, fearful, and low at times due to what's been happening. And part of that, I think, as we move forward, we'll be trying to get back into the kind of routines that we had before, where young people can spend time with each other. And but it does seem so much longer when you're young.
Absolutely. And I think about, young people, but also people who've just finished their exams, and they're about to burst out into the world and explore. It's so tough, isn't it? Whereas for me, I think I've done a lot of traveling and I've done a lot of various things in my life, moving around. So actually, like you say, a year, it's quite nice to just go, oh, okay, I can sit back for a little while and not do so much. But yeah, I think it's a tough environment for young people.
It is, and that time when young people are in the process of coming towards leaving school and leaving home, those years, there's so much change.
Yes.
And I think it's been a very tough time indeed.
Yeah. And what do you think might be solutions or help that might parents could offer, or we could give for ourselves if we're the ones that are feeling isolated and down?
I think the thing to do, it is difficult.
Yeah.
I think the thing to do now is to try and recreate some sense of routine again. Even when you're feeling, this has been such a strange time, not losing those regular things that we do that give us some sense of an anchor in life, I think is really important. I think there are certain things that you have to do every day for good mental health, to get some sense of balance. They're not things I particularly enjoy doing, like going to bed at a good time, eating sensibly and taking exercise, but those kind of routines, as in the book, they get into routines where they go outside, they do things, they exercise, they eat a lot, they enjoy themselves, and they come in and they sleep. And those are important, but also having pleasures built in, having pleasures and things that you can achieve, things where you set yourself goals of things that you want to do each day are important. And I mean, I know from my own problems with my mood how hard it is sometimes to stick to those routines. But what I think what really I appreciate about the book is the way that they create those routines, and they create a routine in the way that they've not had it before, where they were both leading these kind of chaotically miserable and isolated lives, and then they get into a routine where each day they go out into the garden and they do things together.
Yes, and it is a lovely rhythm, isn't it? And then I'm assuming that because the seasons change, they will then adapt their rhythms to be able to incorporate the growth and the death of nature, that sort of cyclical nature. But I love it when they're inside and it's raining, and you might be able to hear the rain here now. And Colin's really frustrated. It's like, I just can't do this. But they then find another outlet,
another thing to do.
They?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think those are the things that as parents you have to do. I mean, I'm not a parent, but I do know it's about finding ways that children can enjoy themselves and enjoy play, but also find ways to structure their day.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that's why school, even if you don't like school, you'll miss it because you miss to some degree that structure,
the rhythm
and the rhythm of going there each day.
Yes.
But what certainly comes over for me, and I was thinking about this, before our conversation, and thinking there's something for me. It's not just about grieving. It's very much about recovery, and it's about healing, and it's about that healing. It's healing without a therapist, but actually the therapist is the garden. And to some extent, their friend is also the therapist.
Yeah.
And so you have this orchestrated therapy, which is being in the garden and doing magical things together. And you don't necessarily need a therapist to do that. You can often do that by doing those things in a place that you love. There are different kinds of therapy in the world, and they do their own therapy in the garden.
And then it's that moment where they're all in the garden and they've relaxed, they understand one another, the animals are there, which are also very healing, aren't they? And then suddenly, because you talk about that in your book about how important animals are, but then when they race out and rush into the arms of Archibald Craven, the image that I have is them walking across the grass and having been in disparate places around the world, but in disparate places in their own hearts, that here they are walking together, and it's the metaphor of the whole, isn't it? That somehow, like you say, they have found a way through the healing power of the garden and their friendship into a more wholesome place, which is where Mrs. Sowerby and Dickon and Martha, for me, represent and no family is perfect, but they represent that wholesome family, don't they? That wholesomeness inside of us.
They represent, I mean, Winnicott, who's a very famous child psychiatrist, talked about people needing good enough mothering, and they get that. Many of us didn't have that, and we get that with therapy. And it doesn't have to be perfect mothering. It's good enough. And in a sense, that family provide that. They are there. The people around them are holding them. And there is a place for that to happen, which is in the garden. And they kind of facilitate it and orchestrate it and provide those safe boundaries. And the garden is bounded. It's a safe place to be. It's difficult to get into, but it's safe.
And actually, because it's walled, it is actually physically bounded as well as metaphorically bounded. Yes.
So it is a magical space, but it's a safe space.
Yes.
And I mean, people often say, do you have to have therapy? Do you have to do these things? And you don't, because very often those kind of natural ways forward are enough for people.
And actually, writing can often be that, can't it? Creative endeavour, creative work can often provide that, can't it?
It can, absolutely. I've seen people who've been depressed feel a tremendous power of achievement in having created something. It's a form of work.
Yes.
It's doing something. It's as I said earlier. It's an achievement. It's doing something constructive that matters to you.
Yeah.
And writing is a way of doing that, just as spending time in the garden is a way of doing that. Many different types of creation.
Yeah. Do you know, it's such a full and rich book, isn't it? And I wonder if that's part of why it has endured for such a long time, because it is this journey from a place of isolation into harmony, community, and belonging, which presumably we all long for in a way.
Yes, I think we do. And I think we all know many people who would benefit from, or would have benefited from, that kind of experience. And I think that's something that, you know, when I think of my own experience in therapy, it's the gardeners. The garden, I think, is a metaphor for having therapy.
Yeah, interesting.
But it can in itself be therapy. And this morning I've spent time in a garden with people in the local mental health charity that I'm a trustee of, and we've spent time together in the garden, working, and then had a cup of coffee afterwards. And I came back from that thinking I felt very well prepared for this afternoon because I'd spent time in the garden.
Yeah, yes, in springtime.
Absolutely, and everything's coming through. And where I thought there was barren earth, there's all kinds of things growing, and it's just lovely.
Yes. Do you know, I could just carry on talking to you all afternoon. Thank you so much for sharing some of your wisdom with us, and for talking to me about this specifically. Thank you. A pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for asking me.